Welcome to this high-yield explainer. Today, we are breaking down a truly monumental text, one that is absolutely pivotal if you're a CSS or PMS aspirant. We're looking at Christophe Jeffrelot's highly acclaimed book, Pakistan at the Crossroads. Whether you're grinding through Pakistan affairs, current affairs, or international relations, this analysis is going to arm you with the exact structural frameworks, the right vocabulary, and the deep insights you need to score high. Basically, we're taking a really dense, heavily cited book and translating it into a fast, strategic toolkit just for you.
Okay, let's dive into this. The title of the book itself poses a pretty massive question, right? What exactly is this crossroads? Well, when we say a nation is at a critical juncture, we aren't just talking about, a temporary political hiccup or a bad election cycle. We're talking about a defining moment. It's a point where the path chosen will literally dictate the survival, the future prosperity, or the potential collapse of the entire state structure over the coming decades. And Jeffrelot's central thesis is that Pakistan is standing right at this very intersection today. So to define the stakes right out of the gate, Jeffrelot neutrally outlines three potential trajectories for the country's future. Path 1 is democratic consolidation. This is the hopeful route, right? Civilian supremacy, real tax reform, economic stability. Path 2 is a military takeover, or just the continuation of a hybrid regime, a state of affairs he calls muddling through. And Path 3, the most pessimistic of the bunch, is state failure, or increased jihadization. Every single structural issue we're going to cover today is actively pushing the nation toward one of these three distinct futures. To make this as efficient as possible for your exam prep, here is our roadmap. We've structured this explainer into 4 clear parts. First, defining the crossroads. Second, we'll diagnose the 4 structural crises. Third, we'll look at his prescriptions for the future. And finally, Section 4 will show you exactly how to apply this whole framework to ace those CSS and PMS exams. All right, let's jump straight into Part 1, defining the crossroads, focusing on identity and nationhood. The author draws a really sharp contrast in how nation-building played out in the region. He notes that while India leaned heavily into civic nationalism post-independence, meaning they focused on territorial and constitutional identity, Pakistan went a different route, relying on ideological nationalism. Jeffrelot argues that Pakistan historically utilized religion, along with a pretty strong anti-India sentiment, as the primary unifying glue for its incredibly diverse ethnic populations. So the crucial takeaway here is that this early reliance on ideology over, say, civic institution building created a really unique set of vulnerabilities that are still causing shockwaves today. Moving right along to Part 2, the 4 structural crises. Let's dig into these entrenched issues. This brings us perfectly into our diagnosis. Jeffrelot makes a vital distinction here. The crises facing Pakistan aren't just accidental bad luck. They are deeply, deeply entrenched structural factors. And that brings us to a defining quote from the book that you absolutely must memorize for your essays. He says, "Pakistan is not a failed state, but a state that has failed to become a nation." This sets the philosophical tone for his whole thesis. It suggests that while the actual state apparatus, like the military and the bureaucracy, is incredibly resilient and nowhere near failing, the organic, unified sense of nationhood among its diverse people remains fractured. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer gravity of this single number, 1%. According to Jeffrelot's data, that is the percentage of the elite who actually pay income tax. It's staggering, right? This shocking fiscal reality creates what political scientists call a rentier state. Because the state literally cannot fund itself through domestic taxation, it becomes inherently dependent on external rents. Think foreign aid, massive IMF bailouts, or leveraging strategic geopolitical alignments, all just to survive day to day. In stark contrast to that extremely weak tax base, we have to look at how resources are actually allocated. Jeffrelot reports that approximately 18% of the national budget is directed toward the military. It is fascinating to see how this disproportionate allocation shapes an entire country into a security state. This allows the military establishment to dominate not just defense, but foreign policy, internal security, and even significant sectors of the domestic economy, which, as Jeffrelot points out, often totally overshadows civilian governance. But the fragmentation isn't just economic or political, it's deeply social too. The author identifies a massive education crisis that has effectively created 3 Pakistans. First up, you have an elite English medium system producing these highly globalized citizens. Second, a madrasa system focusing entirely on religious instruction. And third, a severely underfunded government Urdu medium system.
When you have three completely disjointed education systems running parallel to each other, society naturally becomes structurally fragmented. There's just no common national narrative or shared worldview holding everyone together. To really understand how all these crises evolved, Jeffrelot walks us through a vital, fast-paced historical timeline. The 1980s brought General Zia's Islamization laws and the use of jihadism as a state policy to secure strategic depth in Afghanistan. Then, the 2001 post-9/11 war on terror introduced immense external pressures and, of course, terrible internal blowback. In the 2010s, the 18th Amendment attempted to address all that ethnic fragmentation we talked about by granting unprecedented provincial autonomy. And finally, by 2016, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, emerged as this massive, sweeping geo-economic lifeline, though, to be fair, it's one that introduces entirely new dependencies of its own.
Okay, on to part 3, prescriptions for the future. Let's look at the way forward.
Think of this as your ultimate exam cheat code. We've distilled Jeffrelot's diagnosis into a highly memorizable 4C formula. Whenever you're asked in an exam about the challenges facing the country, instantly map out these structural issues. You've got a crisis of identity, where ideology clashes with ethnicity, a crisis of governance, marked by that civil-military imbalance, a crisis of economy, driven by incredibly low taxes and sky-high debt, and a crisis of security, stemming from regional conflicts and internal extremism. It's all connected. And to perfectly pair with those problems, here are the tactical solutions. I like to call this the 4R formula. Reform the tax and education systems. Rebalance power to genuinely ensure civilian supremacy. Pursue reconciliation, both internally with marginalized provinces and externally with neighboring countries. And finally, rebrand the nation entirely, moving away from being a security-obsessed state to becoming a thriving geo-economic hub. Let's move to and see how this builds into the specific step-by-step changes required for Jeffrelot's optimistic 2030 scenario. First, true democratic consolidation requires establishing absolute civilian supremacy over the military establishment. Second, the state absolutely must broaden the tax base, specifically targeting the elite and the untaxed agricultural sectors. Third, implementing one unified national curriculum is totally essential to bridge that socially fragmented society we talked about earlier. And fourth, the state must definitively dismantle all militant groups, abandoning any of those old good versus bad militant policies once and for all.
Finally, part 4, acing CSS and PMS. Let's talk about practically applying this framework.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how to utilize the book's concepts directly in your exam answers. When you get a question on civil-military relations, you apply the security state framework. For essays on extremism and national integration, you critique the ideological state. If the question is about the IMF or the economic crisis, you deploy the concept of the rentier state. And for questions on the 18th Amendment or federalism, you frame it perfectly around Jeffrelot's concept of a fragmented nation. It's basically a perfect mapping tool for your syllabus. But wait, top-tier candidates always show balance. You can't just agree blindly. You must provide critical nuance by mentioning the book's limitations. Look, Jeffrelot wrote this back in 2016, so many scholars argue his view is overly pessimistic. It completely misses the subsequent rise of new political forces, the actual progress of CPEC, and Pakistan's successful exit from the FATF grey list. Furthermore, he writes from a decidedly Western analytical lens, which some critics say overemphasizes religion and underplays the inherent everyday resilience of Pakistani society. Lastly, just acknowledge that his data predates major global shifts like COVID-19 and the messy complexities of our recent coalition governments. We want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to use in your exam conclusions. According to the deep structural analysis we've explored today, Pakistan's greatest vulnerability is not India, but its inability to transform itself from a security state into a welfare state. That right there is the true crossroads. Can the state finally shift its focus from merely surviving external and internal threats to actually enriching and unifying its citizens? That is the million-dollar question. And that wraps up our explainer on this incredibly vital text. For more in-depth preparation, custom mind maps, and past paper MCQs based on this exact structural framework, you definitely need to reach out to instructor Tausif Iqbal Khan. You can contact him directly at 0341-191-2554. Actually, let me say that again just in case you're grabbing a pen. 0341-191-2554. Keep your studies focused, keep your arguments structured, and whatever you do, don't forget to subscribe to Dawn Times for more.